Developers don't always have the time or the money that they need to make games as perfect as they would like to. Sometimes, games release with less polish or less content than we would hope, or sometimes they even come out, well, barely functional with severe technical issues. Now on the PC, these problems are often solvable. Before the age of live services and constant updates, responsibility for fixing games didn't really fall on anyone's shoulders once those games were out in the wild. However, through time, there have been heroes who have crawled out of the woodwork and took responsibility upon themselves. So, today, let's talk about fan labor. Unofficial patches, mods, third-party tools, and even guides to get a product actually working. Like with any devoted set of customers, lots of games have had significant value be added to them by their fans. Hard work is a reward in and of itself, sure, but there are situations where fans have actually carried entire games on their backs. The first games we're going to talk about today are fairly obvious. Bethesda's library. Seemingly since time began, the Elder Scrolls and Fallout series have had an insane amount of content and even design changes through mods. In fact, there are plenty of people, myself included, who would argue that Skyrim, as an example, is an infinitely better game with a full combat and magic overhaul. And while not everyone might agree with that, it's a testament to fan labor that people will go and design and implement massive changes to a game to actually better implement its fantasy. Or they maybe will put months and maybe even years into working to implement, well, let's just say, other fantasies. I think you all know of a YouTube channel that covers those. Either way, those games are elevated, and the mistakes of the developers, be they perceived or otherwise, are fixed by the hard work of players who aren't usually monetarily rewarded. Of course, there are examples of people getting money because of Patreon's prominence, but that's something we're going to talk about a bit later. What matters more to the core of this story is the extent to which this is often not content and balance. There are fan patches and fixes that make these games significantly more playable. Looking down the patch notes of the unofficial Skyrim or Oblivion patches is honestly mind-boggling. These games are definitely made what they are by their fans. They're not the only culprits though. One of the most famous examples of all is a game that was saved by a single fan in many ways, and that game is Dark Souls. It was an absolute mess when it first arrived on the PC platform. It was locked at 30 frames per second, it was poorly optimized, and it had extremely limited options. As far as a release goes, FromSoft should have been ashamed with themselves for releasing it in that state. However, for the PC community, hope was not lost. The core technical issues, the problems with that game, were solved by Durante, who became a household name in the PC gaming community. His software, DSFix, came and it solved so many problems. FPS unlocking, a wide variety of new rendering options, borderless full screen, and more. Without DSFix, Dark Souls on PC would have been extremely hard to recommend to anyone on a technical basis. Durante created other tools, some generic and some game-specific, to add more rendering options and the like. He then went on to open PH3 Games, where he and others actually assist with PC ports. Through that, his work on the PC port of Trails of Cold Steel is legendary. Among improving them on a technical basis, he also implemented an instant resume from save launch function, skipping all menus and getting straight from Steam into the gameplay. If that's not the finest example of a fan knowing what other fans want, well, I don't know what is. Sadly though, he can't do everything. Nier Automata is another example of a PC port gone wrong. While an absolutely incredible landmark game, the port suffered from annoying bugs and terrible optimization, which resulted in a rightly deserved poor initial reception on Steam. Luckily though, Chaldean was on point to fix it, and a tool called FAR is the DSFix equivalent for that game. Without their work, that game would have suffered far more than it deserved to. Our last example for a straight-up developer mistake is a recent and important one. Capcom, for all their recent glory, seem to have left the Street Fighter team out when discussing, well, how to succeed with launching a game. Street Fighter V, since its launch, had a glaring issue with netcode that left the online experience, well, pretty much terrible for a decent sample of its players. Now that issue is called one-sided rollback. Basically, whenever two game clients would get out of sync, the game never bothered to adjust speed to get them back in sync with each other. That resulted in one or both players constantly getting rolled back to what was really happening. And you can see in this footage how genuinely awful and game-ruining an experience it is, and the sad thing is, it was not a rare experience. This bug was reported publicly in beta, but was never addressed by the developers. Well, 4 years after Street Fighter V's initial launch, the conversation around netcode kicked up again with the Champion Edition launch, and a player almost solved it entirely. A community member called Altimore reverse-engineered the game and wrote some code to fix the problem, forcing the game to resync. And while this was of course up to individuals to install the fix, and it obviously only works on PC, it actually drove a ton of positive reception around the game itself. This discussion reached a fever pitch, and the game's executive producer basically said they'll fix it officially. Their fix, well, it forced file verification so that players could not mess with the game before playing online, which, of course, killed Altimore's fix entirely, and they then made some small changes to the netcode. They reduced how far the game would desync at varying levels of ping. It was an improvement for many, but it was clearly done in a hurry, and it was not as aggressive nor as good as Altimore's fix. The story of Altimore is a particular example that speaks, well, I think exactly to why fans can fix games when sometimes developers can't or won't. It's very likely that the Street Fighter V programming staff don't have the agility to make those quick and important changes to the game. Developers of an online game with an extensive esports circuit have a lot of responsibility to consider when moving quickly. There's bureaucracy to work through, as well as the need to carefully consider the impact of any changes across the entire player base. Altimore had the freedom to make some changes and just throw them out into the world, unlike the actual programmers of the game, who would need to verify the effects in dozens and dozens of situations and different hardware configs, or, perhaps more importantly, stop their work in something else that the company may actually consider to be more valuable. While this may explain why some of these problems happen, it doesn't excuse them. It certainly doesn't excuse the likes of Bethesda's terrible games releasing into the wild, seemingly with Bethesda just expecting that their fans will do a ton of the work, like those unofficial patches that effectively do fix their games. It doesn't excuse Japan's awful history with PC ports, nor the fact that fans fix these issues and then the developers, who maybe made the mistakes or were working for a company who would not let them implement the needed solutions, well, while they are rewarded with more sales. These things simply should not happen. However, they do, and it's thanks to fan labor that we've got much better games as a result. And then there's the dark side that yes, these companies get much better sales as a result of that unsolicited, free fan labor. I'm somewhat loath to call it exploitation of fan labor because it does imply intentionality where we can't confirm there is intentionality, but when push comes to shove, developers release these products and are profiting off the hard work of fans. As to what can be done about that, it is hard to say. Paid mods are an interesting idea, and perhaps if they were in a non-corrupted, community-led fashion, they could actually work, but I think the repeated outcry and the failure of the Creation Club has stopped that from succeeding, at least for now. There are of course ways for fans to be rewarded for doing their work though. Patreon. Skyrim Together is a shining example of this, and while it's down to about a fifth of earning what it was at this time last year, which admittedly was a rather crazy amount of money, it is currently pulling in almost $6,000 monthly on Patreon. That is a sizable amount of money, and it does provide a fan-funded incentive to continue the development of that mod. Really, the market providing incentives for fans to labor and actually be rewarded, well, that's a way to turn passion into content, and this can be seen in World of Warcraft. There are some add-ons and third-party services that provide an insane amount of value, some of them that essentially make that game at the higher end actually be playable, and many of them are funded via Patreon, and it's actually got to the stage where it has created full-time development jobs for some people. That is the bright side. However, money can obviously muddy the waters. Fan labor quickly stops being fan labor once financial incentives get involved. They can become employees or entrepreneurs. As evidenced by Bethesda, the game's devs are likely to want in on it directly. This can be good, but it can sometimes be a bit dangerous. We actually had a run-in with this a few years ago when we started making an add-on for World of Warcraft. WoW Tales was a fan project ran by us that would be adding writing and voice acting to zone quests, bolstering the weaker elements of World of Warcraft's questing. I still stand by what we created. I think it was, well, basically far better than what was actually in the game, and technically speaking, it was not violating any of Blizzard's terms, and I kind of got the cursory go-ahead from people at Blizzard. However, we launched it, the trailer really seemed to be something that got people excited, and Blizzard's lawyers were not particularly happy with that for a variety of reasons, and they asked us politely not to continue. We, of course, complied. At the end of the day, you can't really fight Blizz. Direct attention from the dev isn't the only danger either. Money being involved in fan projects can actually remove a little bit of what makes them so special in the first place. You know, that they're acts of love and come from a pure desire to make the game that they love better for everyone, or maybe even just for themselves. Money being involved can sometimes change the developer priorities and even introduce drama amongst teams, something that we have seen happen quite a lot before. After all, making a product for money versus making it because you want to, well, that can be very different. Now, there is one thing that I will say. If incentives are created and those incentives are successful, they can drive the behaviors that we want. So you could say that if paid mods, or say modding via Patreon, was actually possible and normal, well, that could lead to a more vibrant modding scene where people could decide that they maybe have a passion for modding, but, you know, they can't mod that much because they've got to be at their day job. So I think there is actually potentially a very bright future there in finding a happy medium between passion and between putting food on your table with that work. Now, speaking of that almost taken to the big leagues, fan work can actually have outstanding results for everyone involved. One of the best examples of this, I think, ever, is Sonic Mania. The devs of that were fan game veterans and were tasked with making an official game after presenting a prototype to Sonic Team. It, of course, was considered to be the best Sonic game in 15 years, and it sold over 1 million copies in 8 months. Now, with all these stories like Sonic Mania being built off the back of years of people modding just because they wanted to, or maybe Durante fixing Dark Souls and leading to a stupid amount of sales for FromSoft, you know, we could look at these things as an exploitation of fan labor, we could rail on how modern games just have too many business incentives, but I think what we could also do, which is maybe the best thing, is just to celebrate games being improved, because for all that talk of exploitation, at the end of the day, that is time that was freely given by those people, and they would have absolutely understood that yes, they were putting in some free time to make a community tool or maybe a mod or a fix that would make a bunch of money for the developer of the game, but for them what was important was that it was work that they felt like they wanted to do, and they felt like they were serving a community who really wanted it. Now, there are great situations where that can actually feed back into the industry through, say, experienced hires, indie games, or just straight up inspiration. We've got examples like Durante doing some porting work. The Sonic Mania Mania team, of course, getting picked up to do Sonic Mania. There's then also the area of straight-up inspiration. The global phenomenons of Counter-Strike and the MOBA genre, they came from Valve and Blizzard engaging with their modding communities. Well, I'd say less so for Blizzard. I mean, the prevalence of League of Legends is arguably down to Blizzard not engaging enough with that modding community. Developers, therefore, should look to what their communities do naturally just because they want to and use that as a guide, because nothing says, we want this feature more, than somebody actually taking their time out of their day to make it themselves and then other people actually playing it and enjoying it. And while it's frustrating that developers do make mistakes, or maybe are forced to make mistakes, or are forced into a situation where things can't be ideal, well, that's unfortunate, but they're not infallible and reality sometimes sucks. It's in the industry's best interest, though, to work together and actually improve games. Durante's work helped to improve Japanese PC games, and just look at how much that scene has blossomed in recent years. Sekiro is really not that technically impressive, but I'll tell you what, it runs at a solid 60 frames per second, and it's pretty darn stable. That's a lot of improvement from where FromSoft's previous PC titles actually ended up, and it just goes to show the sort of ripple effects of these modders putting in that work and actually pushing the industry forward, sometimes in areas where the industry itself doesn't even know it can push forward, or maybe doesn't have the will to push forward. So there you have it. There is an angle of these big companies making mistakes, and then these noble modders coming in and actually fixing up the games, but then not really getting a financial windfall from it. That is a little bit uncomfortable. Now, I will say that, those modders, they're giving their time freely, they understand what they're getting into, so there is that, but still, that's a little bit uncomfortable. But even with that, there's all of the good that it's actually done for gaming, and all the incredible mods that have extended so many games. This really is a vibrant area, and when I think about it overall, it's sad that in many ways modding has sort of been less of a thing with a lot more modern franchises as time has went on, but it is nice to see, even with things like, say, the Master Chief Collection, that there is a bit of embracing of mods going on there, and I would hope that the most intelligent developers out there would see all of this natural community just sort of bubbling up and would work out, how can we actually encourage and support this? One game I think has done this fantastically. It's one you may not know of, and it's one that I'm going to leave you as a recommendation. It's Mount & Blade Warband. Now yes, Bannerlord's about to come out, but Mount & Blade Warband is a great example of a game being designed for modding, and then the modders just absolutely blowing it out of the park. And then also even one or two projects like their Napoleon extension that I believe had modders be involved as well. So a fantastic case study that I think you should look into as a bit of extended reading after this video. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.